The Bible is the most influential book ever written. Studied, loved, hated, banned, and translated into a multitude of different languages, it tells the story of the man from Nazareth, the Christ, the Son of the living God, who came to be worshipped by the early Christians as the resurrected Lord and God incarnate. But can we trust the Bible, more specifically, the New Testament? Does it contain real history, and does it accurately describe who Jesus is, what he said, and what he did? Our guest on this episode of the Atheist and Christian Book Club is atheist and New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman. We talk with Dr. Ehrman about his 2005 book, Misquoting Jesus, and try to answer some fundamental questions about how the texts of the New Testament have been copied. Dr. Ehrman shares his insights about what copy errors and variations in New Testament manuscripts mean for how scholars and laypersons alike interpret and understand the New Testament today. Here is the co-founder and host of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, James Walker.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker. I'm the co-founder of the book club. I'm a Christian, part of the equation. I am a Christian apologist. I am president of Watchman Fellowship, which is an evangelical ministry focusing mostly on new religious movements, world religions, but we are also very interested in atheism. And so our other co-founder, which we'll meet in a little bit, is Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist, and we've been doing this for about, I think this is in our fifth year now of doing the book club. And what we typically do is we'll alternate. We have a Christian book one month and an atheist book the next month. We've been blessed to have some of the top, in this little narrow field of apologetics, some of the top both atheist and Christian writers, philosophers, historians, scientists. We've been blessed in that way, and we've got a great one tonight. I see Bill's here. Is that Bill? Yeah, Bill is here. He's on Teresa's phone now. Somebody changed his name to Bill. He's incognito. So listen, I'm going to go ahead and pitch over to Bill, but you ought to know this, Dr. Ehrman. You were instrumental in Bill's conversion from Christianity. He lives there in North Carolina at the time, in Raleigh, and you were instrumental. I think he met you once or twice briefly, but your books were very much so. He's pushed real hard to get your books. In fact, this is the third book we've done. First time to have you here in person with us, but we've done Jesus Interrupted. We did How Jesus Became God. We've done those two books already, and so Bart loves you. So in fact, I was telling several times. I said, Bill, I think that Bart Ehrman loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and he agreed with that. So,
and I've got three more spiritual laws.
So yeah. So anyway, our guest author, and finally we get the man himself here with us, the author. This is our third book to look at. We're looking at Jesus and the Misquoting Jesus, which I think put Dr. Ehrman on the map. I think that was his first New York Times bestseller. But Dr. Ehrman is, he is a former fundamentalist, former evangelical, has all the evangelical credentials from Moody, from Wheaton, did his PhD under Bruce Metzger at Princeton. But he is a former Christian now, and I would say probably the preeminent skeptic, agnostic in the area of textual criticism. And blessed to have him here. I'm going to let the actual introduction go to Bill, and maybe the first question or two, since you've been waiting for this for many years now, Bill.
13 years.
13 years.
Okay. So anyway, I was in Sunday school class at Colonial Baptist Church, and a friend of mine said, hey, Bart Ehrman's going to be at Barnes Nobles. And I said, what is Bart Ehrman? So I go there, and the rest of my life soon turned to destruction. um, within 30 minutes, I realized I had no clue about biblical scholarship or anything to do with Christianity. So I go to the church and I start saying, well, there's like contradictions and discrepancies and variants and so forth. And they go, right. So within like 6 months, I was cast into the utter darkness. They said, do not come back to this church. We do not want you. I lost I gave the Gospel of Judas. I gave a girlfriend that. She took it to her pastor. Then she immediately broke up with me. So I have suffered immensely for New Testament, American and German scholarship, but I count it all for lost for the beauty of knowing the truth. So anyway, so Bart Ehrman actually was going to be the next C.S. Lewis and went to Billy Graham's alma mater, Wheaton College. Then he studied under the premier New Testament scholar, Bruce Metzer, who mentored him, and he actually dedicated a book to him, and actually went to the next level. But the genius of Bart Ehrman, James, is that, and by the way, Dr. Ehrman, one of your guys that wrote the opposite book, How Jesus Became God, or How God Became Jesus, Stewart, the guy out of Australia, said that Bart Ehrman is a genius. He somehow took the most boring, inane topic, textual criticism, and turned it into a national bestseller. So anyway, and by the way, Bart Ehrman has an excellent video on human suffering. I was watching it the other night, and he has a blog where all this money, am I right, Dr. Ehrman, goes to charity?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right.
So a lot of people can talk a big show, but Dr. Ehrman actually puts his money where his mouth is and donates this to charity, which I really admire you doing this. It's very noble. And by the way, one of our members is Ken Daniels, who was a former atheist. And he is a member of your blog.
Okay.
He's a former Christian, now atheist.
So Ken Daniels was a missionary to Africa. He became a hardened atheist. He's one of the most brilliant people. He actually wrote a book describing his deconversion, Why I Believed. But Dr. Ehrman, he's in trouble. He's in trouble. He listened to Stephen Meyer. Are you familiar with him?
No.
He's Mr. Intelligent Design. He was on last month, and he has some brilliant arguments on the origin of life, the cosmological argument, and he gives evidences like 10 million to 1 why it's impossible for life to exist without a transcendent God to invade space, time, and matter. So anyway,
I point out that there are more than 10 million planets in the world.
You might want to talk to him. I mean, but he's Ken Daniels. I don't know if he's here tonight, but he's in trouble because I heard he's about to rededicate his life to Jesus Christ. So
good for him. Why not?
So anyway,
where did you hear that?
That's the rumor, Ken. I mean, you said it. We got it on camera. Now, here's my question. You and Dale Evans, you wrote the book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium.
Dale Evans?
And, well, you know Dale Evans, right?
Oh, Dale Allison.
Dale Allison, I'm sorry, Dale Evans. Anyway, he wrote a similar book, Jesus of Nazareth, Millenarian Prophet. So they both come to the same conclusion that the best way we can understand Jesus Christ from the time of Albert Schweitzer is he's an apocalyptic prophet who thought, though, kingdom was coming. He came in the tradition of Jesus or of John the Baptist, where the kingdom is at hand, the time is fulfilled. And even in Paul saying, don't quit your day job. There's going to be no long term. Don't get married. We have a tradition, and even 100 years before Jesus, we have an apocalyptic tradition of the incoming. And what's interesting is you're an agnostic and Dale Evans is a Christian, but you both come to the same conclusion. In his new book, Resurrecting Jesus, Dale Allison says Jesus was wrong in his epilogue. So you have two scholars, preeminent scholars, that say that the best way to understand Jesus is as a failed prophet that, get this, who had a bad weekend in Jerusalem. So please tell me, why should we believe your interpretation of the Jesus scholarship rather than John Dominic Crossan, who believes the best explanation is that Jesus was a cynic, not someone cynical, but someone who lives off the lay of the land, who doesn't have a place to stay, who basically lived off the streets, you know, about cynicism and so forth, or Marcus Borg, a social critic. Why is yours the best explanation?
Yeah, well, okay. So that one will take a 3-hour lecture. But thank you for it. Yeah, Dale Allison is a very fine scholar. I would rank him as one of the top, very top New Testament scholars in the country, in the world. I mean, he's as good as they get. But he's also a good historian. And he knows how one deals with historical evidence. His book and my book are, they both do come to the same conclusion. They get there in different ways. His book is really written more at a higher level than mine. His is written probably, I used it this last week actually for my PhD seminar. I had my PhD students read it. And mine is written for a general audience. It's not meant to be heavy hitting scholarship. His isn't really heavy hitting, but it's, you know, it's a little bit demanding. And it's not surprising that he and I both come to the same conclusion, really, because it's the conclusion that the majority of scholars in North America and Europe have had for over 100 years. And so the only what ended up happening is this. And Albert Schweitzer popularized this idea that Jesus was somebody whose mission was trying to convince people that God's kingdom was soon going to arrive. And they needed to repent because there was going to be a massive destruction of those who were opposed to God. And only those who sided with God would survive. And there wasn't much time left. His own generation is going to see this happen. And so that's what Schweitzer's view was in a nutshell. And Schweitzer wrote this book in 1906. And since then, it's been the majority view of scholars since then, and has been confirmed by all sorts of things, including the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which absolutely confirms that this was a major point of view in ancient Judaism in the time and place of Jesus. And so it continues to be the major view. The surprising thing was in the 1980s, a whole bunch of books started coming out arguing that Jesus was not an apocalypticist. Books arguing that he was a cynic philosopher, which is Crossan's view, or that he was a kind of a Galilean holy man, which is Borg's point of view, or he was a political revolutionary. There are all these various views, and all of them were arguing against the apocalyptic view. And the problem was that since almost all scholars held to the apocalyptic view, apart from evangelicals and other conservative Christians and fundamentalists, but like critical scholars who were just doing history, the great majority had that view. So the only books coming out were arguing against the view, and it looked like then nobody held that view anymore. And Marcus Borg was going around the world. I mean, I was saying that American scholars no longer think Jesus was an apocalypticist. And people like Dale Allison and I thought, you know, that's nuts. That's just not true. Everybody I knew thought this, you know, but nobody's writing a book about it because that's what everybody thought. You know, you don't write a book on what everybody agrees with. And so anyway, so that's why I wrote my book, and Dale wrote his at the same time. And so we got to this, you know, and we can talk about the reasons for it if you want. I mean, you know, I could talk all night about that because it's very important. And it's what I argue in my book. I try to give the reasons in my book for thinking this.
Well, and it says, you will not go to all the towns of Israel before you see the Son of Man coming in power. So, I mean, it seems to be the silver bullet against Christianity, doesn't it? I mean, that you have a failed apocalyptic prophet, right?
No, I thought this when I was a Christian. And Dale Allison thinks it. And Dale Allison, we both share one of my best friends, is Joel Marcus, lives across town here, taught it, do it. He thinks, I mean, this is what I learned at Princeton Theological Seminary. So the only reason people think it's a death knell for Christianity is because they've accepted the fundamentalist definition of Christianity.
Okay, and Dale Allison still is a Christian, right?
He is a Christian. Yes, he's a practicing Christian.
Yeah.
And so is Joel Marcus. I'm telling you, I learned this from people who were training ministers. This is the standard view among serious academics who work on the historical Jesus.
Well, in his new book,
anti-Christian.
His new book, Resurrecting Jesus, he does give a very balanced view. He gives the evidences for Christianity that it was birthed in Jerusalem, where it could be easily falsified. You have the transformation, the sudden and dramatic transformation of the apostles who had checked out. They were gone. And it seems to have huge explanatory power that there might have been a resurrection of Jesus.
I don't agree with that.
Well, here's what I'm going to ask you is Richard Swinburne out of London or whatever says that, there's a 99% chance. Tim McGrew, who's going to be on our club next month, feels there's like at least in the 90s, I'm sure, that Jesus Christ resurrected. So my question to you is 0 to 100, what are the chances that Jesus resurrected, that the Orthodox view is true, that he is God and so forth? 0 to 100, what's the chances?
You can't do history by percentages.
Okay.
If somebody says that this is 99% probable, it's meaningless.
Thank you.
Because the only way you could determine that it's 99% is if suppose you've got a page that has writing that has a page of the New York Times, like an article from the New York Times, right, that's written out, and you've got somebody who copied it. And you can then, if you've got the original and you've got the copy, you can compare them with each other and say, this is 99% right. Right. But how do you say something that happened in history is 99% right? On what grounds do you do that? I'll tell you what Swinburne's grounds are, and they're ludicrous.
Bayesian?
No, he uses Bayes' theorem, which is the theorem that, of course, Richard Carrier uses to prove that Jesus never existed. And so the same theorem proves that Jesus never existed and that he was physically raised from the dead. It's the same theorem. Okay, what's that tell us? So my point though is that I am unable to say what the chances are that Jesus really raised from the dead. Because all I can say is that the chances of a historian demonstrating it are 0.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The chances of a historian showing what my grandfather ate exactly 60 years ago today for lunch, the chances of that are 0. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
So I was trying to convince my PhD students of this last week, and not all of them were convinced. But my very strongly held view is that we have to realize that history is not the past. The past is what happened. Trillions of things have happened since we started this program. Mm-hmm. Trillions of things have happened in the world. History is what we can show probably happened. And there's a very small slice of what we can show probably happened. So lots of things are in the past that are not part of history. Historians have a 0 chance of showing that a resurrection happened, but it doesn't mean it happened, and you can't put a percentage.
Yeah, I know, but it impacts people's lives, and they have to make a decision. Do I give money to this, like here in Dallas, oh my God, the mega churches, we got, ICR, Institute for Creation Research. And have you, your books are mainly, and this is your, expertise is New Testament scholarship. But, what would be interesting is like with Steve Meyer with, intelligent design, young Earth, old Earth, that controversy. Have you ever thought of doing something a little bit different, going to the Old Testament or that controversy, the young Earth, old Earth?
Well, there's no controversy about young Earth, old Earth. I mean, there's no geologist in the world who thinks that the world was created 6,000 years ago, who teaches at a research university.
Bingo, but 60% of the churches, and Ken Ham, when I was at Providence Baptist Church, they crammed this stuff down there. Oh, and at Stephen Davis Church, go ahead.
But I'm not going to talk about. I mean, it's just nonsense. I mean, why would I try to refute nonsense?
Because 60% of the churches believe, the population believe this.
But if they're not going to believe experts, why would they believe me?
Because you have a voice.
So do they. Look, I'm not a geologist or an astronomer, but anybody who does physics or astronomy, I mean, there are no scientists who believe except for people who are fundamentalist Christians who have a reason to think this.
Well, you're absolutely right. Mary Schweitzer over at NC State, where you're from, said that, hey, there's young blood in dinosaurs. There's, it seems to be way too young for millions of years. And the young Earth people just went nuts. And she said, wait a minute, there's 100 things that show the Earth is old. Okay. I'm just saying that you got 60% believe the friggin' universe is 6,000 years old and they need help, and you can help them.
No, I can't help them. I can't help them. I'll do what I can. And what I can do is deal with my expertise.
Right. Okay. Speaking of your expertise, we go to a little Romans Bible study, and I couldn't wait to get to Romans 5:1. I don't know if you're familiar with it. We have peace with God. Huh?
There's a textual problem there.
Yeah, we have peace with God is the indicative.
That changes the meaning of it.
Yeah, as opposed to the subjunctive, where you have the let us have peace, which seems to we have to work there and so forth. So this variant affects, and I remember when I was at UNC, I went to your talk at Chapel Hill, and you said, I said, do these variants affect major theological issues? And you said, I can make a list as long as my arm. But anyway, Teresa has a question about your mentor, Bruce Metzer. Here you go, Teresa. Go ahead. You want to say it? Go ahead.
So my question to you is, Bruce Metzger gives it an A+ rating on the indicative that we have instead of we will have. What is your take on that?
Okay, so I need to explain it to everybody else. So Romans 5:1 says, since we have peace with God, I'm doing this from memory. I haven't looked.
Therefore,
let us be. No.
You want me to read it? I'll read it.
No. Since we are justified, read it out loud.
Okay, Dan. So this is the NASB. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. With a footnote of let us have peace instead of we have peace.
That's it. So it's the idea is that it begins the same way in all the manuscripts. Does everybody understand that we don't have? Did people read my book, by the way? I mean, yeah. Okay. So there's this textual variant there. So Paul has just been arguing in the first 4 chapters that the only way to be justified before God, the only way to have a right relationship with God, is by faith in Christ's death and resurrection. And he concludes that at the end of chapter 4. And then he starts chapter 5 by saying, therefore, since we are justified, and then the next word is, let us have peace, or we do have peace. It's an important issue because in one way of thinking about things, if somebody is justified, they already have peace with God. That would be a statement of fact, and in Greek, that's given with a verb that's in the indicative, a statement of fact. There are some manuscripts, though, that don't have the indicative, they have the subjunctive, which is a hypothetical thing, or can give an exhortation. And in those manuscripts, it says, having been justified, let us have peace with God. So let's try to be at peace with God. And so the question that they're asking is, which is it? Is it the subjunctive or the indicative? And here's the tricky thing. I must talk about this. I must talk about it in the book. I don't even know. But the tricky thing is that scribes who were copying the book of Romans, some of them were having somebody read it out loud to them, and they're writing it down as they were hearing it. Okay? So they weren't reading it on the page and then copying it. They were hearing it. And the difference in this case between the indicative and the subjunctive is whether the O is long or short, And in Greek, you can't tell the difference. It's either elpomen or elpomen. It sounds the same way. And so if a scribe's hearing that, they might write one or they might write the other. So that complicates the issue. And so the big question is, which did Paul write? Did he say we have peace with God or let us have peace with God? I agree with Metzger on this. I think it was we have peace with God, the indicative. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I think it's right, but I don't think it's an A+. Metzger had more of a theological stake in this matter because he was a very committed Christian, and he had a very strong Calvinist view of things. And he thought if you're justified, you have peace with God. And I'm not 100% sure about it, but
But the earliest manuscripts have the subjunctive. Our earliest and best manuscripts, right?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Because, I mean, our earliest manuscripts are probably what, 300 years after the original?
True.
So, I mean, it got changed somewhere 300 years earlier. We're not sure which way it changed. And so, yeah. And the thing is, you can see, you've got to ask, for a case like this, you have to ask, what's more likely that Paul wrote? And you also have to ask, which is more likely the change a scribe would have made? Would a scribe more likely make it a statement from something that was an exhortation? Or would they be more likely to make it an exhortation if it's a statement? Or if it's just a pure accident because the scribe misheard the thing? It's a very complicated issue.
Well, and just like with the 10 lepers, you remember Jesus said that he was angry at the lepers. Well, first we said, if I have to heal one more leper, I'm just going to shoot my brains out, And then he said, but they changed it to he was compassionate because, and isn't it the case that you take the harder reading as the most trustworthy?
That's one of the criteria, but there are a large range. There's a large range of criteria, and you have to consider the entirety of the evidence. In this particular case, you're talking about Mark chapter 1, verse 42. Yeah. And this leper wants to be healed. And it says, Jesus, feeling compassion, reached out his hand and healed him. But in one Greek manuscript, it doesn't say that. It says, Jesus, getting angry, reached out his hand and healed him. And in this case, and so getting angry, what's that? What? And so in that case, that's really the harder reading. And it's kind of difficult to understand why somebody would create that reading instead of the other. But almost all the manuscripts have the other. So it creates a problem. And so
but it goes along with Jesus' character. Remember the cursing of the fig tree in Mark was in season and he still cursed it. Matthew looks at it and he goes, oh my Lord, what a hothead. We can't have this. I'm going to take out the in season part so he doesn't look like such a hothead. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it does seem a little strange that if it's not the season for figs, he'd be upset with the fig tree. But the passage is probably meant to be symbolic because in the Old Testament, the fig tree represents Israel, and it appears to be this certainly doesn't go back to Jesus, I think, but a storyteller is telling the story about how that the nation of Israel has been condemned because it doesn't bear good fruit.
Okay, well, back to you, James. Thanks, Bart, for
Okay, thank you. Yeah, lively. Okay, Greek questions. Okay, bring them on.
Hey, Bart, I just want to say, again, thanks for being part of our club today. I read your book a long time ago, and then I listened to the Audible this time to refresh my memory, and there was something I was trying to remember that seemed to be important at the time, but it wasn't really on the Audible that I could remember where I heard it. So I got on the Kindle edition and I tried to Google it or word search it and try to find it there, and I couldn't find it there either. And I'm thinking, am I losing my mind? It was a comment you made about Bruce Metzger, and then I started kind of going online. Maybe it was a different book, and so I'm Googling it, trying to find it out. So what it looks like is there was an edition of your book, not the first edition, not the current edition, but an edition of your book that had in the appendices an interview or a catechism, a question-answer section. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to refer that to the long ending of Bart. Can I do that? Do you mind if I do that? Okay. So in the long ending of Bart, I think it's a very, very important observation that you make in that. But before I get to that, I've got to ask myself the question: is that authentic, or is it a overzealous scribe that added this to it? Was it actually part of your original manuscript, or is this something that was an addendum that was added? You know what I'm talking about? The interview that was at the end of, I think it was 2005 edition.
Ringing a faint bell because it was a very long time ago. I wrote it in 2005, but I published it in 2005. But I think in the paperback edition there's an interview. Is that it?
Yeah, it was a paperback edition, and so I finally got it. Actually, I've got it right here. Let me put it up on the screen because I wanted to ask you about it.
I think they sold the hardback pretty well, and they wanted to have some added value for the paperback, so I think they added an interview. But I really don't remember who interviewed me. Even I don't remember anything about it.
Well, I found this long ending of Bart, and so I just transcribed it. I found the actual scan of the page, and I just brought it over to a slide here. But the question was, Bruce Metzger, your mentor in textual criticism, to whom the book is dedicated, has said that there is nothing in these variants of Scripture that challenge any essential Christian beliefs, such as the bodily resurrection of Jesus or the Trinity. Why do you believe that these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? So your response on that is Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times. I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian. I am not. We are in complete agreement on the number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands of possibilities. So the position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. That here it is, the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. What he means by that, I think, is that even if 1 or 2 passages that are used to argue for a belief have a different textual reading, there are still other passages that could be used to argue for the same belief. For the most part, I think that is true. So the bottom line is, it seems to me that kind of offsets a lot of what you were saying in the book itself, because you have this idea that you find in that you have these amateur scribes, some of them making purposeful changes in the text, some of them are just incompetent. You have the idea it's almost like so many variations and changes. It's almost an act of God miracle that there's any similarity between 2 texts. And so then though it seems like you're saying that you agree with Dr. Metzger that really there's no doctrinal problems or issues. And so I know that you can kind of, in the interview I didn't kind of get that sorted out, but that's why I wanted you to share with us, which is it? What would you say? Are these variants causing tremendous doctrinal questions, or is it intact because you have so many other places to look?
James, I have to admit, I've heard this before from other people, and I've never understood it. I still don't understand what you're seeing as the contradiction between what I say in the book and what I say about there not being any theological doctrines that would change based on
it text. Seems like
let me just clarify. In the book, I never say anything about textual variants affecting being the source for major Christian doctrines. It's not part of something I even talk about.
Well, it seems like that you're saying that at least in some cases you had both what we would consider false teachers, but also Orthodox believers purposely changing the text in order to support a doctrine. So
yeah, but I've never said that these doctrines are based only on these textual variants. My whole point is that there are a lot of textual variants that impact theological understandings of things. There are no textual variants that are going to change your mind about a doctrine. And I've never said there were.
Well, I'm not talking about changing my mind.
The other confusing thing about it, the other confusing thing I have about this is that people seem to think, a lot of Christians say, well, if it doesn't affect any doctrines, then why does it matter? And that seems like a very weird thing for me.
No, I'm with you on that. It matters because you want to, which I admire about you, not being a believing Christian, you still think it's very important to want to know what the original actually said. And in fact, it's more important to you than it is to many Christians, which is ironic.
That is ironic, but it's much more than that, James. It's much more than that. One issue is, just to give you an example, we were just talking about Paul's doctrine of justification. Paul has a doctrine of the atonement. He believes that Jesus' death is what brings a person into a right relationship with God. Depending on which textual variant you go with, Luke either does or does not agree. I argue in my book that Luke does not have a doctrine of the atonement. Luke doesn't think that the death of Jesus is what put you into a right relationship with God. And the only reason to think that Luke might think that is because of a textual variant that wasn't originally there. Now, it's not going to change your view of the doctrine of the atonement or anybody else's view of the doctrine of atonement, because you can find it in Paul, and you can find it in Mark, and you can find it in other places. But it does seem to me important to know that one of the gospel writers does not have a doctrine of atonement, has a different understanding of the death of Jesus. It's not going to change your doctrine, but it's going to change your understanding of the Bible. And that's a very, very different thing, but it's still really important. And I could go down the list. I mean, are there any, there are textual variants that determine whether Jesus explicitly calls himself God in the Gospel of John or not. Depends on the textual variant. Does it matter? Yes, it matters a lot. Does John have Jesus explicitly call himself God? Depends which text variant you go with in John 1:18. But is it going to affect your understanding that Jesus is God? Is it going to affect the doctrine? No, because you're going to think he's God, whatever the textual variant is. And so what I've always been puzzled by the evangelical criticism of my book, saying that I'm contradicting myself, because I say there are all these variants, but I don't think they affect doctrines. But I don't understand that. I mean,
I think part of it might be that first of all, let me say I do really appreciate your writing style, and even when I don't agree with you, you're very, very easy to read and listen to. It's very you keep my attention, and I really appreciate that. But I think part of what the case that you seem to be making is that we really don't know any of the text. I mean, it seems like that of what you're saying at some places. Let me just give you an example of what I'm saying about that. Things like there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament. Yeah, now that's true. That's true.
It's not only true, but Metzger used to say it.
Right. Okay. But I think to the freshmen at UNC, they're hearing that and they're thinking, we don't even know if one word in the New Testament is right because every one of them has been changed. That's not what you're saying.
In fact, I say it's the opposite.
Right, because where we can't really know on the one hand, but then later on you make the case that you have a really good indicator that you do know what it probably said. And here's the reasons. You list out reasons why this is probably the preferred reading.
That's right.
And so in the practice, when you get into deeper into the book, it kind of settles out some of what sounds to me like hyperbole a little bit in the way you're setting up the arguments.
James, it's not hyperbole to say that there are more variants in the New Testament than there are words. It's not. It's an.
Well, right. I know that and I understand that, but I'm just putting this again back in the freshmen coming out of high school, and they're sitting.
Okay, I mean, I'll tell you what I tell my freshmen. I'll tell you exactly what I tell them, and it's what's in the book. Even for some reason, I don't know why people don't see it, but it's in the book. It's exactly what I say. We have more manuscripts of the New Testament than we have of any other book in the ancient world. That's the good news, I tell my students. The bad news is there are more differences among these manuscripts than any other book in the world.
Well, I think you point out that if you only have one manuscript, you have no variance.
Exactly.
And then every time you add a manuscript,
that's what I say.
Right.
And we have somewhere between 300,000 or 400,000 variant readings in the New Testament. That's bad news. But
you do come out, though, and talk about the difference.
The good news is, James, the next sentence says, the good news is the vast majority of these differences are completely insignificant, immaterial, and don't matter for anything other than to show that scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than students can today.
No, and I was going to say that too. So I agree. You do say that. I don't
understand what I'm supposed to say. I mean, am I supposed to not say that we have all these variants?
No. By the way, Dr. Ehrman, there's a guy named Gurry who's he's a young guy who studied under Daniel Wallace, who says you're too conservative. There's 500,000 variants.
Yeah. No, I know. He thinks there's 500,000.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's written a book. He's all. I mean, look, I know him. I mean, obviously, and so, but I think evangelical Christians got upset with this because I insisted that we don't know what the authors of the New Testament wrote. And I will go to my death thinking that. If we know what they wrote, why don't we agree on what they wrote?
Well, let's take one that's very significant. No one knows the day of the hour, neither the angels are in heaven nor the Son. Now, this makes, Mark, I think, says, nor the Son. Matthew goes and looks at this and goes, nor the Son? That means Jesus doesn't know the day and the hour. That means he's probably not God. I'm going to take that out. Is that not correct? And is that not a big theological thing?
It's a big theological thing, but it's not a textual variant. It is a textual variant in Matthew because
leave it out?
Well, Matthew left it out, but he's not a scribe. He's an author.
Well, so Matthew goes and changes it. Mark, when he has Mark in front of him, he goes, "Oh, I don't like that, so I'm going to take that out." Does that?
Oh no! I think it's very significant. But my book isn't about that. My book is about scribes who are copying Matthew. They're not about what Matthew did.
Oh, I got you.
Once you get to what Matthew did, that's even bigger problem. And that's what Jesus Interrupted is about. It's about how Matthew changed Mark, and not just changed him, sometimes contradicted him.
I have a question, Dr. Ehrman. It's a simple one. It's more along the level of something you might get from your freshman class. I engaged more of your work more formally at Houston Baptist University. In my master's degree, I studied a couple of classes under Michael Licona that I know you know. So that's how I really got introduced to your work. So it's thank you for coming and thank you for allowing us to talk to you today. So one of my papers for Dr. Licona, I had to basically read a couple of your books, watch a lot of your debates, and I wrote a 6,000 word essay on your work in grad school. But just an example from your book on page 55, you say the top of the paragraph under the changes of the text subsection, far and away the most changes are the result of mistakes, pure and simple, slips of the pen, accidental omissions, inadvertent additions, misspelled words, blunders of the sort or another. Now, a quick clarifying question before I go on to my second part, so I'm not getting this wrong. That quote means what you're talking about are what you can actually see when you sit down at the table and look at manuscripts, correct? These are the things that you, oh, look, that's off, that's a different mark. Yeah. So these are physical.
Yeah, they're physical. What happens is you take two manuscripts, mm-hmm. and you compare them word for word the same. And you find that most of the differences are that kind of thing. Somebody misspells a word or leaves a word out.
Okay.
Accidentally.
Okay. Yeah. So that is that what's in the corpus of the, whatever we're talking, 500,000 variants? Is that?
Oh yeah.
Is that,
okay. No, all those are included.
Okay. So I flipped over to page 58. At the end of that section, you say, and there's several other issues that you address in this chapter. I don't mean to skip over them, but basically that's part of it. You say, given these problems, how can we hope to get back to anything like the original text? The text that an author actually wrote is an enormous problem. And I don't know if this is what maybe James was getting at, but this is what lodges in my head. I look at the thing I just read about the minor variations, and then I get to the end of the section and I see that
suddenly this is an enormous problem about knowing what the original said. And I think for me, that's where I see the difficulty in saying these are minor mistakes, but here's a big problem anyway.
Okay. All right. So this line started out with somebody asking me, does this affect any central Christian doctrines?
Yeah.
And I'm saying no. Then it was, but you talk about all these variants. And I said, yes, but most of them don't matter for anything. Then I said, there are variants that matter a lot. Mm-hmm. And I said, there are some places where we don't know. All of those things are true. And so what I say in 55 is absolutely true. Most of the variants don't matter for anything. They're just slips of the pen. Some variants matter a lot. And there are places where we don't know what the original was.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't see what the contradiction is.
Well, the last part of my question was in being able to, I'm sure, like I'm reading your book with Dr. Metzger right now. There is significant historical scholarly agreement on what we can. There is, I mean, I'm sure you agree. There's a bedrock of basic truths about the New Testament, about Jesus and Paul that we can derive from the text. But you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying we don't finally know, despite the textual evidence, what the originals are, and that's a problem. That's the argument of the book, correct?
That's part of the argument of the book.
Okay, and so just one more, and then I'll be done. But
I do need to explain that, because I'm not sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Look, I mean, for the Gospel of Mark, our earliest manuscript of Mark, so if Mark was copied in the year 70, and most people think it's around 70, it doesn't matter. You can say 50, you can say 100, it doesn't matter. But our first fragmentary copy is from around the year 200, and it contains portions of half the chapters. So portions of 6 chapters, or 8 chapters, portions of 8 chapters. That's our first copy. It's done maybe 140 years after Mark was written. Our first full copy of Mark is not until the second half of the 4th century, probably 300 years after Mark. After that, we have lots and lots and lots of manuscripts, not right away, but when you get down to the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, you start getting lots and lots and lots of manuscripts. Those lots and lots of manuscripts are great if you want to see what the text looked like in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Mm-hmm. The 4th century manuscript is great if you want to know what one scribe had as his text of Mark. But it's 300 years after Mark. How do you know that Mark was not changed during those 300 years so that the manuscripts we have are based on original Mark rather than a changed Mark?
But do you think we have enough in Mark between those two similarities to make a relatively, I know we're not dealing necessarily in probabilities, but Dr. Wallace has said this, that there's enough there to say we pretty much can know what the originals were. But you're saying we don't have
enough where?
Enough similarities in the manuscripts themselves, whether they're 4th.
No. Okay, so you're not getting my point. Suppose Mark, don't blame you because it's not an easy point.
That's okay.
Okay. Suppose Mark was writing in Rome, okay, in the year 70. He writes his document, writes his gospel. Suppose somebody sees this in his church, says, "Oh, I want a copy of that." This is unlikely to be a professional scribes. Everyone would agree that these earliest scribes of the New Testament were not professionally trained. They're just people who happen to be literate in the congregation. So somebody who's not a professional copies Mark's gospel. Probably makes some mistakes because scribes make mistakes. Suppose then, okay, there's nothing at all implausible about this. Suppose Mark's copy stays in that church in Rome, but the copy goes somewhere else, and that copy is copied, and that copy of the copy is copied, and eventually all these other ones are going from that first copy rather than from the original. Then all of our manuscripts would descend from a mistaken copy. And it wouldn't matter if you've got 5,000 copies of Mark that are later, because they would all go back to the mistaken copy.
Okay, I see.
And we don't know if that's what happened or not. And you could come up with 1,000 scenarios that are like that, where you don't know if we've got the original. So when Dan Wallace talks about there being, 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and that's way more than you got of Homer or Plato, it's true. We have way more. Is it true that means that we can get back to the original text? No. And the evidence we can't get back to the original text is that Dan disagrees with the other experts on what this verse read or what that verse read. Mm-hmm. So if we can know, why don't we know?
Okay. So last question, and then I'll turn it over. So in light of all of that, as you as a scholar, this may be more of a personal than a technical or scholarly question. Could the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ explain the Gospels as we have them? Is that possible?
Of course.
Okay. I'm done.
I don't understand the question.
Well, I didn't really know if you thought, and I heard it earlier, that the possibility that the existence of the corpus of the New Testament writings could be easily explained by the resurrection of Jesus, right?
I don't even know what that means, though. What do you mean it could be explained by the resurrection?
Well, that as the best explanation for why we have the New Testament at all. That the resurrection. I
don't understand what your logic is. Why would the resurrection of Jesus mean that we'd get a New Testament?
Well, we would. What ultimately inspired the whole corpus of the writing, the Gospels, Paul's letters, and things like that, would be best explained by the resurrection.
Oh no, I don't think that. No, you didn't say best explained. You said would it be explained? Well, yes, of course, it could be explained by there being a resurrection. It could be explained by people believing there was a resurrection, but there wasn't a resurrection.
Okay, I guess it would have been better for me to say best explanation.
Oh no, I don't think that. No.
Okay.
If I thought that, I'd be a Christian.
Yes. What is your best?
I don't see any logic at all in that statement.
Well, what is your best explanation for why we have it if it's not the resurrection?
Because there are people who believe that Jesus got raised from the dead and it started a new religion. There are hundreds of religions in the world that all start, and you probably think that all those religions are false, but many of them have writings. And religion doesn't have to be true in order to have writings.
I understand. Yeah. No, I just wondered
I don't understand the logic of what you're saying when you say that you have to have the resurrection or you can't explain the New Testament.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I think if the resurrection isn't the best one, what is the best explanation?
There's not a best explanation. There are 1,000 explanations that are all equally good.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Dan.
Really, Dan, it's an important point. I mean, I don't understand the logic. People say things like this, but I just don't get it. What could you explain what the logic is of saying that's the best explanation for why somebody would write an account of Jesus? For example, is the best explanation for why we had writings about Apollonius of Tyana is the best explanation that he really was taken up to heaven? The pagan philosopher Apollonius of Tyana.
Well, I'm speaking about the Gospels.
I'm talking about the writings about Apollonius. Same thing. First century holy man taken up to heaven. We had writings about him from people who said they were eyewitnesses.
But that came after the Gospels were written, though. You have that in a footnote.
Okay. Then how do you explain Romulus? Romulus was before Jesus, and we had writings about him being taken up to heaven. Is the best explanation for these writings that Romulus really was taken up into heaven?
Well, I'm asking you about the New Testament, what you think the best explanation is.
And the reason your argument doesn't work, Daniel, is because you won't apply it to anything else.
No. I absolutely do.
Okay, so you think that Apollonius really was taken up into heaven?
I think something happened, but I'm just asking you.
I think something happened with Jesus.
Okay, so
it wasn't a resurrection.
I think it's called special pleading.
It is what it's called. You use that evidence for your case, but you don't accept the same evidence for other cases.
But
it's not evidence. It means it's just something you're using to support a view that you hold.
But given, well, okay, I don't want to take up our time with.
No, I think we should. This is an important point.
Okay.
I think the problem with Christian apologetics is people say things that are convincing to their audience, but they don't make any sense. It's like that in textual criticism. In textual criticism, you always have Christian apologists saying, we have more copies of the New Testament than for any other book. Therefore, we can trust the New Testament.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say, if I want to put your argument I want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly.
Okay.
You're saying that the best explanation for you of the resurrection is that some followers thought this happened.
No. Look, we were talking about why we have a New Testament, and you said the resurrection is the best explanation for why we would have writings about Jesus.
That's what I believe, yes. Yes.
But I don't know why you believe that's not a logical. It could be your belief, but it's not an argument.
But this is what the texts give us. Why would it be? If it's not true, why would this be the central, seemingly the central piece of these texts?
If Jesus' resurrection wasn't true, why would people say that it happened?
Yeah.
Okay. If Romulus really didn't descend to heaven, why did people say it happened?
Well, no. The question about Jesus, why would they make that up if that didn't happen?
They didn't make it up. I don't think they made it up.
Okay. Well, what happened?
But see, this is the thing, people,
well, what happened? I'm just asking.
I'm going to tell you what I think happened. I'll tell you what I think happened, but I get very upset with apologists who draw a conclusion that nobody would ever draw. If you say, well, I don't think it was racial, you must think they made it up then. I would never say they made it up. But people draw that conclusion. So what are they thinking? And why are they even, why is that the thought that occurs to them?
Well, given that
the disciples were liars, huh?
Well, given the message, the central message of the Christian faith, Paul says if Jesus is not resurrected, our faith is in vain. I'm trying to understand, if that's not why these Gospels in the New Testament is written, then what finally is your best explanation for why we have that message?
The disciples believed that Jesus got raised from the dead.
Okay, so is that's it? That's your explanation?
That's history. Your explanation is theology. There's no problem with theology if you want to be a theologian, but you shouldn't be a theologian and then claim to be doing history.
Well, I'm not a professional historian or a theologian. I'm just somebody that reads your books.
I know, but you're taking a theological view and claiming it's history.
Well, it is history. We have a whole corpus of writing that's theological and historical. You say lots of historical.
That for lots of people. We have it for Muhammad, for example.
Right.
And I assume you don't believe in Islam.
Well, I think something happened, right? So
I think something happened with Jesus.
Okay, but that something is given to us in the text, and you don't think that something happened, correct?
That's right, just as you don't think that the text about Muhammad really happened.
So how come yours isn't special pleading, but mine is?
Because I'm applying the same criteria to both.
How so?
Because I think something happened in both cases, and people who were mistaken wrote about it.
So people were mistaken about a resurrection.
You think only in the case of Jesus must it have happened, but it couldn't have happened with Romulus, or couldn't happen with Apollonius, or couldn't happen with Muhammad. Those must be mistakes. Well, in your case, it's not a mistake because it's the one you happen to believe. That's not history. It's theology.
Well, with Muhammad,
let's do this, guys. Let's do this. We've got other people waiting, and I should have done this earlier. We are going to open up for others to ask questions as well in just a moment. And the way you do that, if you have a question for Dr. Ehrman, is that you will text in the text area briefly what your question is. Or you can specifically do it to the whole room, or you can text either Daniel or Brady individually, and then we're going to try to get you in the queue to ask the question. Please remember, we want to keep this respectful. And we don't want to turn into an argument. We just want to ask questions and get the best possible answers to those questions. And I think, do we have? Is Phil waiting to come in?
Well, I have a whole list here, James.
Okay.
So, Bart, I want to thank you so much for coming and accepting the invitation to be a part. And I'd like to thank you for the encouragement to read the Gospels horizontally. It's something I started doing a few years ago. Wanted to see the Bible in a fresh way, and I thought that encouragement was helpful. But I heard you give this encouragement because it would be easier to spot the contradictions in the text. And what I found was something a little bit differently as I read through it, that I found some non-contradictory differences that you would expect from eyewitnesses, which leads me to my question. You made this type of objection in a number of your books, debates, and speeches, but I want to ask you specifically about the claim of the contradiction in the gospel accounts of who showed up first to the tomb. This has puzzled me because none of the four writers claim that their lists are exclusive as to who was there, and that would be what would be required for it to be a contradiction. But I was wondering if there was something from the Greek or whatever reasons that you might have to say that these would be contradictory based on the accounts being different.
This is not one I'm particularly big on. I would call this a difference or a discrepancy. but it's not a flat out contradiction, as you have others that are contradictions. And I think you can find real serious contradictions if you look for them, but this isn't one of them.
Okay. Do you have one quick on the ready, just for my benefit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've got a million on them already. But I mean, okay. Well, I'll just take one. We were talking about Mike Licona a second ago. So okay. Mike and I were at an apologetics conference back in February before COVID hit, so February 2020, and it was an evangelical Christian crowd, and they thought they would have the opponent there so they could hear his view too, and so they had me, and it was great. They're all very polite, we had a good time, but the moderator, who was also an evangelical Christian, after we'd all given our spiels about how the Gospels are either completely historical or not, which was my view, had us all on stage. And he said, okay, I've got a question. So he's a believer, and I think he believes in the inerrancy of the Bible, maybe, but I don't know. But he says, so in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus sends out the disciples during his ministry, he tells them, so I'm not going to get this first part exactly, but you can look it up. Don't take extra pair of sandals, don't take a backpack, don't take extra money, and don't take a staff. Okay. Matthew reports the same thing. And he says, don't take extra sandals, don't take a backpack, don't take extra money, but take a staff. and so the moderator said, okay. So he had the four of us. So it was Mike Licona and me and who else was it? Craig Keener. No, not Craig Keener. Craig, who was it?
Evans, maybe? Evans?
No, not Craig Evans. The guy who writes all these, I'm sorry. Brain dead at the end of the day. The fellow who writes these very big commentaries on the book of Acts. It's not. Oh, it was Craig Keener. Maybe it was Craig Keener. It's Craig Keener, I think. Craig Keener and somebody else. So he asked all of us, is this a contradiction? Oh, no. What he asks us is this. He doesn't ask that. He says, which did Jesus really say? And we each had to answer. And the other two guys came up with some way to they said, well, maybe he said both at different times, or they came up with different things. And Licona says, he said, don't take a staff. And then I said, well, neither one, there's a contradiction. So, but then the moderator said asked all of us, do you think the Bible, that the passage is inerrant? And Licona said, yes. And I said, Mike, you just said that Matthew changes Mark to say just the opposite of what Mark said. So in Matthew, he says the opposite to what he says in Mark. And you think that they are both inerrant? And he said, yes. I said, okay, you got a different view of inerrancy than I have. Because to me, that's a contradiction. He either said one or the other, but not both.
Thanks for that example. All right, one quick one for you. In reading the Gospels horizontally, have you published a reading list on how to do that in terms? No, it would be a 5,000 page book. I mean, because it's really complicated affair because there are all sorts of things that get changed. Yeah, well, I didn't want to use the term harmonizing the Gospels. Because I didn't want you to take it the wrong way. But I mean, are there any lists out there that you would suggest or recommend to say, hey, these are at least putting the events together in the proper manner?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, what typically happens with graduate students in this field is they get a gospel harmony, a gospel synopsis, where you actually have on the page, Matthew in one column, Mark on a column, Luke and John on a column. And graduate students, one of the training they typically have if they're doing a PhD in New Testament is they buy a set of colored pencils and they start marking these up word for word. Is this the same? Is it in the same place, at different place, at different words? And and then you mark up so you go through an entire passage, marking up the Gospels, and then you look at what you got and you try and figure out what's what. And so that's what you would have to do. So what I recommend people do is just get a gospel synopsis. The best one, I think, is the Synopsis of the Four Gospels by Kurt Aland, which is nice because there's also a Greek edition of it, and there's one that's both Greek and English. So if you've got some Greek, but not comfortable really just reading the Greek, then you could use the one that has both. And if you don't have any Greek, you just use the English one.
Can you say that name one more time, because you cut out right when you said the
Synopsis. I think it's just called the Synopsis of the Four Gospels. It's by Kurt, K-U-R-T, Aland, A-L-A-N-D.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. All right, next on our list here we have Ken. Ken, if you can unmute yourself, and you got the floor with Bart.
Hey, this is a real treat. I appreciate you being here. And I am the one that was mentioned earlier, a missionary who left the faith along the way.
Okay.
I met you at a debate with Justin Bass a few years ago.
Right.
Got to greet you there. So, but the question I have is based on a book that we read recently for the book club, and it's called let's see, 4 Views. I don't see the title of it here. 4 Views on Christianity and Philosophy, and one of the contributors was Tim McGrew. And I know that there's no love lost between you and Tim McGrew. I heard a debate that you had, kind of a knockdown, drag-out debate between you and him on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Brierley a few years ago. But he makes a charge in this book that I thought was pretty direct and inflammatory. And I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to it. And so I'm going to read it a little bit at length if I could.
Sure.
And he says, the common counter-argument is that the Gospels contradict one another, not just here or there, but so extensively that they cannot be taken as reliable records. A good illustration of the popular view of the matter can be found in the 2nd chapter of Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, which proposes to introduce Ehrman's readers to a world of contradictions, in quotes. His cataracted examples viewed at a distance looks impressive, but most of them will not survive even a moderately close investigation. I'm not speaking here of desperate attempts to harmonize every small detail by far-fetched conjectures. I'm talking about the basic charity in reading that we would accord to the documents of secular history, the sort of honesty and quotation that would prevent us, were the subject matter not the Christian scriptures, from omitting inconvenient words when giving quotations in order to manufacture an appearance of contradiction, an appearance that would be destroyed by a quotation of the immediate context. This is a harsh criticism, and though there is no space here to give a detailed account of dozens of examples, I should offer at least 1 or 2 clear instances of this sort of chicanery. Here is one of Ehrman's examples in his own words. And then he goes on to quote you, in John's Gospel, Jesus performs his first miracle in chapter 2 when he turns the water into wine, a favorite miracle story on college campuses. And we're told that this was the first sign that Jesus did. Later in that chapter, we're told that Jesus did many signs in Jerusalem. And then in chapter 3 or 4, he heals the son of a centurion, and the author says, this was the second sign that Jesus did. Huh? 1 sign, many signs, and then the second sign. So then McGrew goes on and says, what happens if we look up these verses for ourselves? Continuing John 2:11, a few words beyond the point where Ehrman adroitly cuts it off, we read, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs. And when we continue John 4:54 in the same way, we read, this was the second sign that Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. And then he says, the many signs mentioned in John 2:23 were, as Ehrman himself admits, worked in Jerusalem, which is not in Galilee. It is perfectly obvious that John is applying the ordinal numbers to the miracles in Galilee, a consideration that makes the contradiction, in quotes, evaporate. It is equally obvious that Ehrman has deliberately crafted his presentation of the alleged problem to avoid giving his readers this information. So I'll stop there. But he goes on.
Yeah. So. Yeah. No, good. I don't know him, so I don't have any feelings about him. I just we had that debate, and he had some rather unusual arguments, I thought. So in this particular case, he's referring to, let me just say, Ken, this isn't something I came up with. This is stuff that people in seminary hear all the time about the Gospel of John. This is like standard stuff. He turns the water to wine and says, this is the first sign, goes to Jerusalem and says he does many signs, comes back, heals the centurion, heals this guy's son, and says this is the second sign. And then what he's pointing out is that it goes on to say, having come from Jerusalem to Galilee. So I don't think he's reading the Greek correctly. What the Greek is saying, in my judgment, is this is the second sign that Jesus did, and he did this one after he came from Galilee from Jerusalem to Galilee. He does not say, this is the second sign in Galilee.
So you think McGrew is the one who is misinterpreting the text?
Yeah.
I just thought it was. I mean, I read it and I was taken aback, and I thought there must be some explanation, because I don't think Ehrman would be that.
Well, I mean, but it's easy. It's easy to set up a straw man and then knock it down.
Right.
But yeah. And again, this isn't like something I came up with. This is like very standard. This is the whole basis for throughout the 20th century, since the 1950s. Johannine scholars have, there used to be a consensus that the Gospel of John was based on a source that scholars have called the signs source. Mm-hmm. John has 7 signs, and in the Gospel of John, there's 7 signs. And the idea is that there is a source that's floating around that John has incorporated into his gospel, that it was just listing the 7 signs of Jesus, 7 miracles he did that convinced people to believe, that ended with what's now John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And one piece of evidence of that has always been, for the last 70 years, that he does the first sign, does many signs in the second sign. And so, of course, scholars, they do know what the verse says in chapter 4. And so it is that we're making things up.
I just think it's a little bit ironic that McGrew talks about charity and reading charitably, but yet he's not willing to read you charitably on that point.
No, well, he has no reason to. Yeah.
Well, Ken, it's a little spoiler alert. Tim McGrew, you didn't know this, will be our guest author next month. So I don't know if you're trying to create more drama for us here with that or not. So
well,
great question.
It really did bother me when I read it. Well, somebody's being chicanerous here.
Well, maybe we can get to the bottom of that. So, yeah. but if that's the case, we probably need to let Dr. Ehrman have a response as well afterwards. But anyway, that just coincidentally is going to be, in fact, and another spoiler alert, we're going to try to make this our first in-person meeting in November, and I'll have the dates and all that for you. So our first, we're going to do it on Zoom and in person. We're going to try to do that. So that's been a long time since we've had the opportunity to see face to face, and I'm missing you guys. So. Brady, do we have somebody else lined up?
Yeah, Phil, you are next. I know you have like 3 or 4 questions. If you could just maybe pick the first 2, and then I think we're going to have time to come back to you. And then John Loftus, I got you right after Phil.
Well, yeah, my first question, Dr. Ehrman, thanks for being with us. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks.
Is do you think we can know anything that Jesus actually said? And then I have a second question, and I can ask them both at the same time, or you can take them one at a time, whichever you prefer.
I think we can know things that Jesus said. I sometimes want to tell my students that I think he probably often said, "Hello." It's just a guess. In the Gospels, I think there are sayings that probably go back to Jesus. The thing I emphasize with my students, that I've been trying to emphasize here without quite putting it this way, is that all of history, not just studying the historical Jesus, but all of history is dealing with probabilities. Not that you can put in statistics, right? It's 73% likely he said this, but there are levels of probability that we always deal with in our lives in trying to figure out what happened in the past. And in my judgment, there are some of the things that Jesus says in the Gospels that we can establish as him probably having said. And there are some things that we can establish him probably not having said. Historians who study the historical Jesus apply a number of criteria to these material to try and figure out what's actually historical and what has been put on his lips by later storytellers. They're basically the same criteria that every historian uses to try and figure out what Caesar Augustus said, or what Charlemagne said, or what Napoleon said. I mean, you have certain criteria for figuring out what people said. And so I do think that there are things that we know that Jesus said, including a number of the sayings that are widely attested. For example, about him saying that he thinks that the temple is going to be destroyed. I think he probably said that when the judgment of God. I think he almost certainly talked about the coming kingdom of God. I think he almost certainly told parables using seeds as an illustration. So there's a long range of things I think you can say that he probably said. And if you're interested in knowing what these criteria are or how they work or how I work it out myself, the first book I wrote is called Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, which is that first book we were talking about in relation to Dale Allison. And that's where I lay all that out, if you want to see what I think he said and why I think he said it.
Okay. My second question is kind of a personal one, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But what is the main reason or reasons that you reject the Christian faith, and is it related to the problems you see in the reliability of the text?
Yeah, no, it's not too personal a question at all. There are very few questions that I find too personal, but I never do reveal my shoe size. So
that was my third question.
Darn it! Glad you can't answer it. So okay. So it's a long thing. I wrote a book about it actually. My book is called God's Problem, and it's about the problem of suffering in the world. So I was a very committed evangelical Christian for a long time. I started out believing that the Bible had no mistakes, there are no contradictions or anything like that. I graduated from Moody Bible Institute and loved it and was passionate about that. And then I graduated from Wheaton College, which is Billy Graham's alma mater, as James pointed out, I think. And so I went through that entire thing. I was a very, very committed evangelical Christian who believed in the Bible. As I advanced in my graduate work at Princeton Theological Seminary, I came to read the Bible. I learned Hebrew there. I learned Greek in college. Then I learned Hebrew at Princeton. And then I started reading these texts very carefully in the original languages. And I got to a point where I just started realizing that there really were mistakes in them. There were contradictions in them. And once I admitted that, I thought, look, if I believe in God, I'm not going to believe that the truth is going to lead me astray. And that if there's something true, then God's behind it, because God's the God of truth. And so I'm not going to ignore the truth just so I can hold on to my doctrines. And so I came to think that the Bible had mistakes in it, contradictions. And then I started realizing all sorts of things, and I became a fairly liberal Christian. I was a liberal Christian for many years, probably 15 years. I don't know how many years. For a long time, I was a fairly liberal Christian. I went to Lutheran church, for example. For a long time, I went to an Episcopal church, and it wasn't about doctrine or the inerrancy of the Bible. It was about worshiping God and serving others. When I started teaching at Chapel Hill, when I taught at Rutgers and when I started teaching at Chapel Hill, I was still a committed Christian, going to church every week, teaching adult Sunday school. What ended up making me leave the faith wasn't anything connected directly with my study of the Bible or my scholarship. It was wrestling with why there's so much suffering in the world. When I was at Rutgers, very early in my career, I just finished my PhD. I had been asked by my chair to teach a course on that was called The Problem of Suffering in the Biblical Traditions. And I thought, this is great. I think because I had long thought that all of the authors of the Bible are struggling with the question of why the people of God suffer if they're on God's side. I mean, if God's their God and he's all powerful and he wants the best for them, why is there so much misery? And not just among God's people, but people who don't know anything about anything, who are just off in the middle of nowhere, just like, why is there such intense suffering? And, it's easy as someone like me, a middle-class white guy, grew up in Kansas, to kind of, say, just kind of to ignore the fact that every 8 seconds, some child starves to death in our world, because I don't see it. It's not in my backyard. Or that 300 people die every day from malaria, or that 300,000 people get killed in a tsunami, and people have all sorts of explanations for why all these things happen. But I thought it's really interesting. I'm going to teach this class about how the different biblical authors deal with this, because my view, even at the time, even though I was a Christian at the time, it was that the different authors of the Bible have different understandings about why they're suffering. And their differences, sometimes they don't agree with each other. the author of Job and the author of Ecclesiastes are disagreeing with the author of Proverbs on this question. Just flat out disagreeing with them. So anyway, I taught this class, and the hardest thing I had in this class was convincing my students at Rutgers, who were also kind of middle class, they were middle-class New Jersey kids, trying to convince them that there's a problem with suffering. Like, what's the problem? So I resorted to, it was during one of the Ethiopian famines in the mid-'80s. And I remember bringing a New York Times in that would show a picture on the front page of an Ethiopian woman who was completely emaciated with a child on her breast where there was no milk, and they were both starving to death on the front page of the New York Times. And I pointed the picture to my students. I said, look, this is a problem. If you believe in God, you need to be able to explain this. So I taught the class. I was still a Christian, and I had my own explanations, as everybody does. And mine weren't particularly unusual. But then over time, I thought more and more about it. And I finally just got to a point where I didn't believe it anymore. I didn't think that there was a God who was in any sense in charge of this world, who intervened for people when they were in need, who answered prayer. I just couldn't believe it anymore. And it was weird. I mean, it was really hard. It was very, very hard for me for lots of reasons. But one reason that it was weird was because I had grown up in my household always saying grace before a meal, thanking God for our food. And I did this all through college. We would say grace, we would thank God for our food. And then I got to a point where I realized that if there, you know, in the time it took to get to this restaurant, there have been, you know, I don't know, 300 children in the world who starved to death. And I'm thanking God because he's given me this food.
Right.
What am I saying about God? It's like, whoa, why didn't he give them food? And so anyway, those are the kinds of things. And of course, you know, there could be long arguments about this and people have their views and everything else. So I don't try to convert people to this. I have no interest in people leaving the faith at all. I have interest in people being intelligent about their faith and people not using their faith to hurt others. If their faith helps them do good for others, I'm all for it. But this is my view. I don't believe it.
So there's this contradiction between whether God exists and the fact that there is human suffering. And so have you come to the conclusion that God does not exist, or you simply come to the conclusion that you just don't believe him anymore? But you're not necessarily trying to make a definite truth claim that God does not exist. You know, is it,
yeah.
You know, where are you on that? Is it?
Yeah. I think it's ridiculous to say that God does not exist anymore. It's ridiculous to say that a miracle can't happen. I mean, I don't know. What the hell would I know? So I consider myself both an agnostic and an atheist, which confuses people, but it's because of how I define the terms. Agnostic comes from two Greek words that mean don't know.
Right. And
if somebody asks me, do you know if there's a God in the world or not? No, I don't know. How would I know? I don't know. I'm just a peon. I don't know. But if somebody says, well, do you believe there's a God in the world who's active in the world? No, I do not believe it. I absolutely don't believe it. But I don't know it. How can I know it? So I don't make any definite statements. I just say, I don't know, but I don't think so. In fact, I'm pretty sure not. And I think that when we die, I think that's it. I think we're dead. There's no afterlife. That's it. We're dead.
By the way, Phil, the reason that we believe that Mark, like when Jesus says these short, what's called aphorisms, where he says, give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, he talks in short, pithy statements. The problem is when we get to John, he goes and talks in these, I am the vine, you are the branches, these long theological statements. So they can't be the same thing. Do you see what I'm saying? The Gospel of Mark, we call it the Messianic secret, where Jesus, hey, don't tell anybody who I am. Let's keep this quiet. But in John, all he does is talk about himself. So do you see how in the Jesus seminar said, don't believe anything in John? Would you agree with that, Dr. Ehrman?
Not quite, but I don't agree with a lot of the Jesus seminar, but I think that most of the teachings in John are not authentic. I think that that's right.
Right.
But I don't see, Bill, I don't see why the disparity between the way Jesus speaks in Mark and the way he speaks in John in long discourses. I don't see why that disparity somehow shows that it's not the same person speaking.
Ask the expert.
Before we go any further, we do need to get down this list of queue for people to ask questions.
I will give shorter answers, so nobody else.
You're fine. You're fine, Bart. You're fine. You're answering actually really quickly. So I appreciate it.
It's me that Brady's trying to shut down.
No, well, okay.
I'll shut up.
We're gonna get back to you, Phil. All right, Kent, if you want to unmute, Kent, not Ken. Ken, you already got your question there.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a little bit, but I think I can make it a little bit different. In light of the fact that editors tried to smooth over doctrinal differences, why didn't they come up with a solution to the contradictions in the resurrection accounts? Could there be some deep point about the details not mattering? And I'm not thinking of errors here. I'm thinking about, based on a true story movie where they're self-consciously just saying, well, let's make it interesting. I mean, even today, when you talk to people, if they're telling an exciting story, they're kind of fudging it. And if you call them on it, they might look at you like, so what? I'm not trying to be truthful about that. But then something shifts when they get to the main point. And for most people, they're being truthful about that stuff really happening. So, and it might only be peripherally related to textual criticism itself. It's kind of about human psychology. So I'm just looking for your sense of, is there a shift that people make between the details and then they go to a different place in their mind when they're getting to a real serious matter that they're going to be truthful and accurate about?
It's an interesting question. By editor, are you talking about later scribes, or are you talking about
just the scribes?
The scribes, yeah. I mean, scribes, are remarkably inconsistent in how they did things. So that, for example, I wrote a book called "The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture," which was meant to show how scribes altered their texts in places to make them more theologically acceptable, more theologically orthodox. And the striking thing is, it happens a lot, but it doesn't happen consistently. And even the same scribe won't do it consistently. And you think, well, that's kind of weird. Yeah, it is kind of weird, but the same scribe will sometimes spell the same word in two different ways on subsequent lines. It's like the inconsistency wasn't really kind of their big issue. But in terms of the, they sometimes would reconcile accounts, but they don't reconcile big things. They tend to reconcile kind of small things. Scribes do, because what scribes imagine they're doing, what they think they're doing is they're copying somebody else's work. And most scribes don't think that they're actually, the author of this work. They think they're copying somebody else's work. And so they pretty much keep it that way. They keep what the author said, unless they're pretty sure somebody's made a mistake. They might think the author made a mistake, but more commonly what they think is, that scribe ahead of me really blew that one. And so, they'll change it. We have evidence they thought this way. I don't know if you can see back behind me. I've got a thing on my wall that is a copy of a page from a 4th century Greek manuscript of the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, there's this interesting at the very beginning of Hebrews, there's a passage that says, Christ, oh God, that's been so long since I've even looked at it, even though it's on my wall. Just a second. I can't remember the Greek word. Sorry. The author of Hebrews says that Christ bore all things by the strength of his power. Something like he bore all things. In this 4th century manuscript, the author originally wrote not that he bore all things, but that he manifested all things by the strength of his power. And it's a word that looks kind of similar. Instead of pharon, it's phaneron. And so it's a similar word. So he wrote, he manifests all things by the strength of his power. That was in the 4th century, and the scribe made this manuscript. A few centuries later, another scribe came along and saw this, and he said, that's wrong. It's not phaneron manifested. It's supposed to be pharon. And so he erased phaneron and put in pharon. Okay? Then a third scribe, some centuries later, read that and realized that the second scribe had changed what the original scribe said, and he erased what the second scribe said and put back the original reading, which was not the original reading. And in the margin, the whole point of this, in the margin, there's a marginal note in Greek that says, "Fool and knave, leave the old reading, don't change it." And so the scribe is complaining that his predecessor, changed the text. And so my point about that is that scribes, when they change the text, often they probably, it's a guess, they probably thought, the guy before me really messed this one up, and I'm going to correct it back to what it ought to be. The problem is when they correct it where it back to it ought to be, they might not correct it correctly. They might correct it incorrectly, and then you got a bigger problem on your hands. Is it possible, your question is it possible that they didn't really worry about the small things, but worried only about the big things? Yeah, absolutely possible. I think most of us do that. Most people, when they read the resurrection narratives, don't notice that there are differences between them. Was the stone rolled away before the women got there, or did it roll away after they got there? Depends which account you read. But you wouldn't know that just by reading them. You gotta do a very careful analysis, and most people don't. And then when you tell them that, most people say, "Well, who cares?" Well, I think the only people who care are people who really want to interpret the text closely and want to understand what this text means, because if it's different, it means something different, either slightly different or actually a slight difference might make a big difference. Those people care, and fundamentalists care, because every word has to be accurate. That's why so many people got upset with my book, with Misquoting Jesus, which you read, because I pointed out we can't know in places. I don't think we can know anywhere, but we definitely can't know in places.
Thank you.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Bart. All right. Bart, tell us your best joke. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. I'm back.
Okay. You're there. All right. All right, Jody.
I thought the rapture happened, but
I know. I was worried.
Hey, y'all got left behind too, but Bart, it's a privilege. I got a YouTube channel, but the main thing I wanted to ask you was you say that we can, know that Paul wrote the 7 letters, but then we can't trust what them letters say. So how do you reasonably think Paul wrote them letters if we can't, trust what they're saying?
Okay, it's a great question. So my view is that if you know somebody wrote something and you know that you're reading exactly what they wrote, that has no relationship to whether what they wrote was true. For example, we know that Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and we know that the words we read were actually the words that he wrote. But I don't think the words are true. And so you have to differentiate between whether somebody actually wrote it, and if we know what he wrote, and whether what he wrote was true or not. And for that, you have to have other grounds for deciding. Is that answering your question, Jody?
I understand where you're coming from, I think. And one quick question. What do you miss about Christianity?
What do I miss about Christianity? I miss Christmas Eve services, which I always loved, and I still sometimes go to them. Rarely now, but I used to go to them even as a non-Christian, because I love the hymns, and I love like a candlelight service. That's very touching for me. As a Christian, I hated Easter sunrise services. Oh my God. It's the last thing I wanted to do is to get up at sunrise. Why do people want to do this? It's like, oh my God, I didn't like that one. What I really miss, I think, Jody, is the fellowship components, that once a week you get together with people that you're not normally chumming around with, who have very similar concerns and similar worldviews and perspectives, and you care about each other, and you try to help each other, and you pray for each other, and you have this kind of community. You eat together, and atheist and agnostic, there are some groups like that, but not really. So it took a long time for me to get over that one.
Right. And is it true? I heard, and I don't know if it's true or not. Is your wife a evangelical Christian, or is she Christian? Or I'm just curious how y'all talk at supper, if that's the case. I was just wanting to know more about that.
So my wife, I don't mind answering this. My wife is a scholar. She's a Shakespeare scholar at Duke. She's one of the leading Shakespeare scholars anywhere. She's English. She came from England, and she was educated in England, and came over here to teach at Duke. She does consider herself a Christian. She is not an evangelical. She is the farthest thing from an evangelical. You probably wouldn't know that she was Christian. Most people have no idea that she's a Christian because there's nothing about her life that would suggest she doesn't go to church. She swears like a sailor. She's very, very funny, and so I mean she's like in a kind of, sometimes I mean like she's just not like she's foul. I mean she's great, but she does not think that Christianity is about believing the Bible. She thinks that Christianity is a way of standing before the God of the universe in awe and revering God. And she's actually far more interested in modern theology than I am. She writes her books on Shakespeare. A couple of her books are very theological. She started out as a medievalist. She did medieval English, and she did her first book was called God's Body, which deals with kind of a theological understanding of things in the bodies in the Middle Ages. So anyway, so she is Christian. We have she doesn't really disagree with me too much. She does not understand why the problem of suffering would lead me away from the faith. She doesn't get it. She doesn't see why that should be a problem. She thinks, and the other thing is that she thinks I'm still a fundamentalist at heart. and that I'm very black and white in my thinking. I'm not very nuanced. She also, by the way, thinks I don't know much about religion. Okay. Seriously. She's probably right.
Thanks for answering my question.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, Bart, if you don't know much about religion, then the people at Moody owe you some money. So, Daniel, I got you next on the queue. So you're up, bud.
Okay, Bart, just to wrap up where we kind of left off. So for everybody else to finish up everything. So we're on and I'm understanding you. So let's talk about what's going on in 1 Corinthians 15 with the resurrection text there, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ is not raised, your faith is worthless. You are dead in your sins. And so where we left off at the beginning, you'd said that something happened in terms of it not being the resurrection, not being the best explanation for why we have the New Testament. And I argued that I think the resurrection is the central message of the New Testament text. If it's not true, then we don't have forgiveness of sins, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:17. And you said, I think I heard you say that the disciples saw something, but they were mistaken. And that's, for you, that's the best explanation. They were mistaken about what they saw. But your best explanation has actually zero textual support when we have this corpus of textual support for an actual resurrection. So I'm wondering, with all your criticism of the text, how can you explain a best explanation without any text whatsoever?
I'm having trouble understanding you, Daniel, because you would agree that Mormons have sacred texts,
yes,
that talk about things that they believed happened.
Right.
You do not believe those things happened.
Not in terms of the historical. Right. We could talk about Joseph Smith. I've got.
And how do you explain their texts?
Well, I've got plenty of.
You don't have alternative Mormon texts that say other things.
Well, I interviewed Robert Bauman. I have written about this and studied about it myself. I don't want to extrapolate on why Joseph Smith's history is questionable.
No, Daniel, you're not hearing my question. I'm applying the same logic that you just asked me about to what you believe. You don't understand how you don't understand how Paul could believe in the resurrection unless the resurrection really happened.
Right.
But you do think that Mormons can believe that Joseph Smith saw something even though it didn't happen.
Well, I'm saying that as a textual scholar, your support, you don't have, for the best explanation of why we have the New Testament text, you don't have text for that, and you're calling it the best explanation.
We do have text for that.
No, the mistake, your idea that there was a mistake, that the disciples were mistaken, Paul was mistaken.
All the non-Christians writing about Christianity said it was a mistake.
Yeah, what would be that mistake? What was it? A vision? Was it a hallucination? What do you think?
What do I personally think?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think what happened is after Jesus died, his disciples were completely discombobulated and upset because they thought that he was going to be the Messiah.
Right.
The Messiah,
Luke 24, the Emmaus Road. Yeah.
Well, I don't think
I'm
the
sorry.
Emmaus Road thing happened. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about history.
Okay.
The disciples of Jesus expected him to be the Messiah. They were upset because instead of doing what the Messiah is supposed to do, which is to drive out the enemy and set up a new kingdom, he was tortured to death by the enemy. They didn't understand that, but they did understand that their lives were in danger, and they probably got out of town as quickly as they could. Probably that night, I would guess. In Matthew, they go back to Galilee, and I think that's probably right. I think what happened is that one or more of them, sometime later, thought that they had a vision of Jesus of some kind. They had a vision. The word vision does not necessarily mean hallucination. The word vision comes from the Latin word video, which just means to see. You can, if you see a tree outside your window, that's a vision. You're seeing it, but it's a true vision. It's something that's actually there. Lots of people see things that aren't there. 1 out of 8 of us, so 3 of us here on this call, will see a dead relative in our lives, and we'll be convinced that this person really appeared to us. 1 out of 8 people have this experience. Your aunt dies, and 2 weeks later you see her in your bedroom. It happens all the time. There's a large psychological scholarship on non-veridical visions, which means visions that people are just seeing things. It happens with groups. Large groups of people see things all the time. There are lots of Roman Catholic groups, up to 500 people, who see the Blessed Virgin Mary, and they'll all swear they saw her. So my view is that the disciples of Jesus believed, some of them believed they saw visions they believed they saw Jesus after his death. And they convinced the others. If you're a Christian, as you are, then the simple solution is that Jesus appeared to them. Jesus appeared to them. If you're non-Christian, you'd say they thought they saw Jesus. Both things happen all the time. My view is that Jesus did not appear to them because I do not believe Jesus was raised from the dead. I don't even think that Jesus was put into a tomb. But that's based on historical knowledge about what Romans did to crucified victims.
But that's not in the text of the New Testament, correct?
The text of the New Testament is written by people who are Christian believers.
Sure.
They are going to write only Christian beliefs. And so if you want to know what the Christians said, you can read the New Testament. If you want to know what happened historically, you would treat the New Testament the way you treat the Book of Mormon. And if you don't want to treat it the way you treat the Book of Mormon or the Quran or any other religious text that you don't believe in, if you don't want to treat the New Testament that way, that's fine, but that's a religious decision. It's not history. So history treats all sources the same way, not different ways.
Hey, Brady, John Loftus is on now.
All right.
Hey, John.
John, are you there?
You've come back from the dead, John.
I had
muted.
Unmute yourself there. Yeah, there he is.
You're muted, John.
You got to unmute yourself.
No voice.
Got it.
There he is.
Dr. Ehrman, I just want you to know I'm a big fan of your work. I really appreciate almost all you do, not all of it, but the little part, the tiny part that isn't. Sit. I have a dog. Just a second. Sit. I love you. I mean, you're a good man, and I have to back away from my dog. All of a sudden, she started to bark.
And I'm glad it's not my dog, because I was we're doing that all night.
I know. We're camping in Matagorda, Texas, where we got married, and I should be able to. I should go over there and say stop, and she wouldn't maul this intruder. But I guess I'm no really. Wait. So anyway, I like to say, truly, I'm amazed at your work, and I appreciate that. I have a question. I emailed you earlier today about that question, but I'm going to say something different. I'm going to ask a different question. Why all of this difficulty with what John the Apostle might have or might not have written, or Matthew or Mark or Luke or others, when I'm pretty sure you agree with me that there is no objective evidence for any of the miracles told in the Gospels. I mean, you have testimonial evidence, and you know David Hume's criticism that testimonial evidence by itself, is not sufficient to lend credence to a miracle. So the question I have to ask you at this point, I love to talk to you. I love to sit down and talk to you. Is this why all the fuss? Why all the discussions with Christians, which I myself do, with about what someone so said and what someone else said, when we know, you and I both know, there's no objective evidence for any of the miracles in the Gospels. Go ahead and talk. I gotta go get my dog. Go ahead. I'm listening.
Okay. Yeah, do listen, because I think that there are a lot of things that we can say actually happened in the life of Jesus based on the gospel accounts. I don't think the miracles are among them. It's not because I deny that miracles happened. It's because I don't think that historians can show that miracles happened. But I don't think it's because of objective evidence. And the reason this will sound weird to many people, I suppose, but it's because I don't know what objective evidence about the past would be. I don't know what that word even means. Objective.
Well, if I might interject, DNA evidence, photographic evidence, clinical trial evidence, and you might say, that's for the, well, that John, wasn't available.
John, that's for the present. That's for the present. I'm talking about the past. How do you have objective evidence about what Abraham Lincoln did?
Well, Dr. Ehrman, here's the point. Here's my point in my book on the case against miracles, is that if there is a God and he knows how to produce this evidence, and he didn't wait until the time such evidence was available, say 2020, then he was inept. Here's a reason why. It's because he could have waited until 2021 to send his son Jesus to die on the cross for our sins, because by Christian theology itself, all of the sins in the past could have been wiped away clean. But this God is inept because he didn't wait until such time as such evidence was available. What do you think about that?
I don't understand what it has to do with objective evidence. I mean, it's an interesting argument, but it's a different thing. I mean, my concern is how we go about establishing what happened in the past. And I don't think that there is such a thing as objective evidence for what happened in the past. What you're raising now is a philosophical argument. If God was going to be like that, why did he do this? Well, that's not a historical question. That's a philosophical or theological question.
So we're in agreement that miracles in the past cannot have objective evidence for it. Am I wrong?
I wouldn't put it that way, because I don't think anything in the past has objective evidence for it.
Well,
I don't even know what that category means. I don't know what the category is. What is objective evidence?
So if anything in the past cannot have objective evidence for it.
I don't think the word objective applies to evidence. For anything, I don't know what you mean by objective evidence. Give me an example of something that you think is objective evidence for the past. Give me something objective.
Well, let's say that Sodom's wife, who turned into salt, could be found and identified, and we could determine DNA evidence that was of a woman in that pillar that we could find. Well, that would be objective evidence, would it not?
That she was his wife? No.
What?
It would show that she existed back then.
Well, they'd have to identify a pillar of salt as Sodom's wife.
A pillar of salt. You said a pillar of salt. If they had DNA, but what would they compare the DNA to?
Well, what they would find is that the salt pillar is of a woman. It has DNA evidence of a woman, and
no, but you're not giving me objective evidence of something that did happen. You're giving me a hypothetical evidence of something that didn't happen. I'm asking you to give me objective evidence for something that you think did happen. Objective evidence.
Well, listen, you are a historian, and if you don't know, I didn't intend for
I don't know what objective evidence is. I don't know what that would be.
I didn't intend for this to be an antagonistic.
No, I'm just saying I don't know. I'm genuine. I mean, I was having this with James too. I generally don't understand what you mean, because
objective evidence is something that can be seen and evaluated by a third person.
So what was
the word that had on it?
What would be objective evidence that? I don't know.
Well, I think there's a worry about, like, how can we know for sure that anything happened in the past, like the Holocaust? There are people that deny the Holocaust. So how do we prove to them that it actually occurred?
Look, this is what I've been saying all night. It's not like doing science. History is not science. In science, there are two things that are objective, really: mathematics, and if you accept Aristotelian logic, as I do, the law of non-contradiction. If two things are contradictory, logically they both can't be true, although quantum physics, of course, has called that a serious question. But if something is mathematical, the square root of 9 is 3. I would consider that objective. It doesn't matter who you are, what your beliefs are, it's always going to be 3. And you can demonstrate it. So you can have mathematical proofs for things, but you can't have mathematical proofs for the past.
Well, here's the thing, Dr. Ehrman, is when we talked to John, one of his concerns was he felt you were being a little dogmatic when you said in your book, Jesus certainly existed. Am I right, John?
He didn't exist. So, okay. I mean, yes, he might not have existed. There might be a 1% chance he didn't exist. But I mean, why would you? I mean, if you doubt the existence, I mean, okay, but apply it to everything then. If that's your level of doubt, do a Cartesian thing and doubt everything. Because what would it take? What kind of evidence would you need? How many people do you have this kind of documentation for from the first century?
Yeah, Dr. Ehrman, John Loftus has written an anthology on varieties of Jesus mythicism.
Yeah, I know.
Are you familiar with that work? Okay. And so we're probably going to. Well, yeah.
I just think that, I mean, I don't have a horse in this race in a sense. I mean, I'm an atheist. Why would I care if Jesus existed? It's like, I don't have any religious reason. It's just that I'm a historian.
But you're saying there's no objective evidence. How can you be certain? You said it. He certainly existed.
I think it's 99% certain he existed.
Wow.
That's close enough. I'm certain my wife loves me.
Well, should John, you not lean on your own understanding, but trust in Bart since he's a scholar in this field?
No, we can't trust somebody else's opinion.
Whoa, who do we trust?
But I mean, look, all you can do is establish what probably happened in the past, and you look at evidence, and you don't argue on the basis of what you want to think happened.
Yeah, Dr. Ehrman, probably about I'm going to guess roughly half of our atheist members are either going to be mythicist or agnostic. You know, if you pin them down on something, that they'll typically say something like, well, we can't possibly know if Jesus existed. Nobody can know that question.
Okay.
And so
for the record, I think he existed.
Right. Not all of them. Many of our atheists, you know, maybe half of them do believe he existed, but we've addressed that before, but we're looking at doing that again, maybe with John's Loftus's anthology. Another guest that we've had before is
look very carefully at what constitutes evidence.
Well, quick commercial for your book on the topic on historical Jesus. Can tell us what you wrote.
Well, I've written a number of books on the historical Jesus, and so do you mean I'm the one that shows that Jesus?
The popular existed? Did Jesus exist? Yes.
Well, it's really just it's just basic stuff. I mean, there's nothing particularly in it. I mean, you know, this is not a discussion I ever have with anyone except for somebody who's got a religious reason for thinking he didn't exist. I mean, it's not an issue. It's like the moon landing. I just don't have the discussion about whether the moon landing happened. It's just, I'm sure it did. I've got evidence it did, but it's not like, it's never an issue. So I've been studying the New Testament rigorously, starting in graduate school in 1978. I have never had a serious conversation with anybody except a mythicist about this. And it was never a discussion at all until 10. It's like, this is not an issue. Just like astronomers do not have discussions about whether there are other solar systems. They just don't. And so I don't have an axe to grind. I mean, if I wanted to get rich, what I would do is become a mythicist and write a book.
Well, you have written some books that have done pretty well.
If I wanted to get richer, I'd become born again and write another book.
Oh man, you may be onto something there.
It's a historian. I just do not. The kinds of arguments that people use, I don't find them convincing.
We have used your clip before. I've used your clip when you were at the Freedom from Religion Foundation receiving the Emperor Has No Clothes Award. And you made a kind of unpopular stance in that group when you said Jesus certainly existed and gave some of the reasons for that. So if we do address that in a future book club, we will try to use your book as one of the sources where we.
I'll tell you what, there are a lot of things today that are getting politicized that I do not understand why they're politicized. And there are a lot of things that are made into religious issues that I don't understand why they're religious issues. I do understand why some mythicists that I know are mythicists. It's because they think it's a silver dagger to the heart of Christianity, and that's what they want to strike a silver dagger into the heart. But it really is not a good argument. It's not good when you use an argument that people laugh at you about.
Yeah.
I mean, I've just got to say, you're not going to convince people by using an argument that other people find risible. Mm-hmm. And there are better arguments. So if that's really what you want to do, I think, you shouldn't be making stuff up about ancient pagan religions. I'm saying that Jesus is like one of these things. You shouldn't do that. Okay. Sorry. I mean, look, as I said, this is not an issue that I ever talk about, except, when somebody raises mythicism.
Well, listen, I want to say thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts. We want to thank you for coming here and spending some time with the book club. Do you have any final words of advice for both the atheists and Christians who we go out of our way every other month to carefully listen to people we don't agree with and try to learn from that? Do you have any advice for us?
I've got three things I'd like to say. One is I think it's an amazing thing that you all are doing. And I hope you can you advertise yourselves because there are a lot of people who'd be very interested in this group. And I think it's completely commendable. So few people listen to those on the other side, especially now. It's awful in our world. So I really commend you for that. Second thing is, I hope you all were not upset that I got contentious at times because that's how I am. And so I'm happy to, and I've got both sides of this. So as you know, I've got both the Methodist and the conservative Christian. So I hope you do have some, and that's my mode. Third thing I'll say is that I think, I forget who it was, mentioned that I have a blog. And if you don't know about my blog, I hope you would think about looking at it. Just look up the Bart Ehrman blog. I post 5 times a week on issues dealing with the New Testament and the history of early Christianity, on any topic involved with that at all. There's a small membership fee. I give all of the money that comes in to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. And so it's a charity. And we have grown and grown and grown. I've been doing it since 2012. And we're on the path this year to raise $300,000. Wow. And I just give all of it away. I don't keep a dime. In fact, I pay for the damn thing. So I'd really like, if you're interested in this kind of material that I do, check out the Bart Ehrman blog.
Well, thank you again for being our guest. And remember, next month, we are not going to be the first Thursday. We're going to be, I think, the Thursday before Thanksgiving. Our guest author is going to be Tim McGrew, Western Michigan University, Christian philosopher. We will come back to some of these issues we've talked about today. Maybe, Ken, you can have that question queued up for him now that we have another side of that, and get some clarification on that.
Just want to put in a plug for his blog. It's excellent. I just don't understand how he can write 5 days a week and such quality work, and how he can teach and do everything else he does and come to these meetings that he's coming to. It's just amazing. The prolific nature of what he does, just hats off.
He's also a professor on great courses. I think is that the learning company or something? Teaching company, that's it, yes. And I mean, that's the cream of the crop, best lecturers. And seriously, Dr. Ehrman, I may not always agree with you, or maybe I even rarely agree with you, but I'm never let down by you take issues and make them very interesting, and I appreciate that. And we would always prefer to see passion over apathy, so never apologize for that. Thanks so much for being part of the club. See you guys next month.
Right. Thank you all.